Hello, everybody. My name is Adam Thorne, and welcome back to the Australian Aviation Podcast. It's been another massive week of news. It feels like everybody's talking about aviation, as they should be.
Absolutely.
As they should be.
The most important topic in Australia.
Without doubt.
If not the world.
Well, of course. And here to dissect this very important topic is two very important people.
Oh, where are they?
I will introduce first a man who, in a Rocky-like story, dragged himself from humble cabin crew to aviation influencer, one of the most important people in the industry. Chris Fenton, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Adam. And yourself?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Excellent to hear.
And another Goliath, another titan of influence. It is Jake. Jake, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Adam. I am here also.
Okay, let's steam in. So let's steam into the news. This is the week after the monumental event. We obviously had, and this only came out a few hours before we recorded last week's podcast, which was the early exit of Alan Joyce, which was a decision made on Monday night the previous week, and obviously had wave after wave after wave of bad stories, which kind of culminated in the ACCC telling that they were going to take Qantas to the federal court over allegations that they had sold tickets to already cancelled flights. And so Joyce basically said, I'm going to give you 1 day more and then I'm going to go early. He was planning to leave in November. So it feels like, and Jake's analysis of this last week, that it was that Alan Joyce would kind of take all of this bad emotion and all of this bad feeling, package it up, and it would all go off with Joyce. Now, we've run lots of stories about this week, but one story we'd run, which did particularly well on the website, I believe it got something absurd, like 60,000 views, which is huge.
Crazy.
Which is Hero A380 pilot saw Qantas crew high five Joyce exit. Jake, steam in and tell us more.
Yes, this was Captain Richard de Crespigny, who was, of course, the pilot of Qantas Flight 32 back in 2010 aboard the first Qantas A380 VH-OQA, Nancy Bird Walton. The engine exploded over Indonesia, but he and his crew managed to turn the plane around and land safely in Singapore. So that is his claim to fame.
It's quite a claim to fame.
Quite a claim to fame.
The greatest captain in Australian history.
Very, very, very accomplished pilot. He has mentioned that he was on a Qantas flight that was coming in, and as it was landing, sort of the news about Alan Joyce leaving early had broken, and he said that he saw staff high-fiving among themselves about 5 minutes before the plane touched down. He said that engagement's at an all-time low in Qantas, and he said this was him talking to 3AW. He said they had 2 aircraft currently grounded because of accidents by ground handling. So he was talking to I think it was Neil Mitchell on 3AW about a collapse of the brand, he described it, at Qantas among staff and passengers due to a loss of trust. He said the national carrier needs to be supported. He said, quote, airlines live and die on trust, which is capability, credibility, vision, value, and particularly care. I think the problem is that for the passengers and the staff that have suffered at the hands of the poor Qantas governance, they find it unimaginable that the CEO and executive should get a massive pay boost while the airline is failing to perform. It shows there's a disconnect and money flows to the top. It's unhealthy and there needs to be change. He said trust is built in teaspoons and it's destroyed in shovel loads.
What is very interesting about these comments, and the reason this story did well on the website, without wanting to talk about the journalism, right, was this anecdote of Qantas crew high-fiving each other, right? And it kind of shows the level of apparent joy at Joyce's exit. But one of the interesting things coming from Captain Richard is that he was for a long time one of the kind of faces of Qantas. This is arguably the most famous captain in Australian aviation history, certainly one of the kind of great heroic acts, the kind of but he's also somebody who is obviously a very measured, smart person. He's not necessarily known for giving Alan Joyce and giving Qantas a kicking in the way that other media commentators are. For him to come out and say all of these things, it does add to this idea that Qantas is in a lot of trouble. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Chris.
I'm on the fence with this, and don't shoot the messenger, but my opinion is Captain Richard made a lot of money from Qantas. and the success of his...
I love this, by the way. Go on. I love this. Go on.
And the success of his book post QF32. And don't get me wrong, it was certainly a heroic crew that day that, in my opinion, performed a miracle. And he's done quite well as a result of the fame that has followed from QF32. So to come out swinging the axe the way he has, it's kind of shocking.
Yes. Oh, I like this.
And you've kind of made your money, you've made your name, you became famous as a Qantas pilot for an unfortunate event that was beyond anyone's control. And now you're kind of digging the knife in the back. And do we know for a fact that the crew were high-fiving because of the announcement of Joyce's retirement? Often, my crew and I would high-five for a job well done or a great flight, like, woohoo, party's over, or woohoo, final flight of a 4-flight day. High five, good job, team.
There have been so Alice Workman from the ABC said on Twitter, I'm not calling it X, midair, the captain of my Qantas plane just announced in breaking news, CEO Alan Joyce has just resigned, and that's all I have to say about that, is apparently what the pilot of her flight said. She said, I was also on a Qantas plane when Joyce grounded the entire fleet in 2011, so I feel like I've come full circle. She then said, the flight attendants have gone in for round 2. Apparently not all of you have heard the first time in breaking news, Alan Joyce has just resigned from Qantas.
I must say it's interesting because obviously Joyce is left and the story hasn't gone away in the way they would have hoped it hasn't gone away. Every day has been full of relentless kind of bad headlines, not really with any new revelations, but everybody is going in on them. And I think a lot of this stuff has become slightly hysterical.
Yep.
And we have spoken on this show before, but a lot of the problems, in fact, 95% of the problems that have affected Qantas in the last 18 months have affected almost every other airline in the world. And in fact, are also problems that have affected Virgin as well, and to a lesser extent, Rex. One of the reasons we're hearing so much about Qantas is, one, as we said on the show before, because Australia has a special affinity with this airline in a way that no airline has an affinity with their country, and people take it quite personally. Secondly, because they have built up bad relationships with the unions, and effectively Alan Joyce has personally, and I think even he would say this, has made a lot of enemies. There are a lot of people now going all in on this. It does feel to me, though, that some of the criticism is becoming completely hysterical. There was a column I read, and I think it was in the AFR at the weekend, made this exact point, that a lot of the problems have happened at other airlines, but also that a lot of the criticism over the help they got during COVID, again, it isn't really looking at the details. Now, they did get a lot of money overall, but the money came in the form of JobKeeper that went directly to the employees, and so Qantas didn't get any of that. And it also came in the form of like supplemented flights. So yes, they were being paid to put on flights, but they still had to put those flights on. They were in no stage ever really given any kind of like lump sum, any kind of like amount of money. So even though yes, they did sort of relatively receive a lot, actually their bailouts were considerably less generous than almost any other major airline in the world.
You're 100% right there, Adam. And there were lots of airlines globally that were bailed out by governments. Completely, like, let me bankroll you alone until things stabilise, because we can't have our national carrier going under. And
there are, of course, plenty of airlines that are owned by the governments of their home nation.
Absolutely.
Looking particularly at, for example, the Middle Eastern carriers, Emirates, Etihad. I believe Etihad is owned by the government of Abu Dhabi. If I'm wrong, sorry. And then you've got Qatar Airways, which is owned by the Qatar government, which is, of course, something we'll get to later. But yeah, and I've lost my train of thought. My plane of thought. I've lost my plane of thought.
Saved by a pun.
Done,
Thank you.
By a pun.
Yeah, it's the thing. Alan Joyce has said, on multiple occasions during the pandemic, Qantas was 11 weeks from bankruptcy. Like they did not. They got the JobKeeper help, but they did not get, massive amounts of bailout money from the government. And they didn't get the support that a lot of these government-owned carriers did get during the pandemic, because, they're owned by the governments of the countries, and the governments need to have their airlines functional.
And I would say as well, and I don't want to go on a massive tangent here, I'm opening up a can of worms, but the one thing that did occur to me is a lot of this is very personal at Alan Joyce as well.
Absolutely.
It's all about, and again, he's the most high-profile business figure in Australia by a long way. If you went up to the average person on the street and you said Alan Joyce, they would all say, or 90%
They would all say, isn't he that guy from 2GB?
I actually once in my early days, I kept on getting those names wrong. Easy mistake to make in a breaking news situation. Anyway, so don't say Alan Jones. Alan Joyce is, the most high-profile person, and a lot of his attacks are quite personal at him. Even though I think a lot of his stuff is incredibly unfair. We talk a lot about mental health in the world nowadays. No one seems to give a damn about his mental health because it is relentless. And I can't think of an equivalent business figure, say in the UK, that's ever had the amount of stick that Alan has had to put up with. He's had this now for years. And again, I'm not saying he's a perfect person. I'm not saying he hasn't made mistakes. But some of the vitriol after the man has given up his job seems to me in the last week, I find it barely believable. Some people need to rein it in.
Well, the uncharitable might say that several $100 million can alleviate that somewhat.
I get that.
Look, at the end of the day, a CEO's job is to run a business. They have to make tough decisions. Not everyone will like those decisions. And when QF32 happened and Joyce grounded the A380 fleet, he did that from a safety point of view. Until we investigate and find out what exactly caused this incident, we can't fly these aircraft. We cannot put our customer and crew on these aircraft. The
issues with the fleet grounding was not surrounding the A380s. The thing that the unions were complaining about with the fleet grounding was the industrial action back in 2011, which was sort of, I think, after the whole thing with the A380, because that happened in 2010. But the bone that the unions had to pick with Joyce, and they never quite finished picking, was that in response to industrial action or possibly threatened industrial action, if I remember the details, Alan Joyce did ground the whole Qantas fleet. And so that is why the unions have been so angry at him.
Okay.
One of the reasons why the unions have been so angry at him.
On that note, we're going to go for a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about how we think his successor is doing. We'll be back in a minute. Okay, welcome back. So one of the things that almost, I don't want to say it hasn't gone reported, but hasn't been talked about that much, is that this is the first podcast we've recorded with a new CEO of Qantas.
It's understandable that not a lot of people have talked about it because it's not a huge news event for people who aren't in the know on aviation.
Which aren't people that we're interested in.
Yeah.
But
hey, listen, I'd love to see, headline news on the front of the Oz. Australian Aviation records first podcast under Vanessa Hudson.
I mean, they would do if they could. I'm sure they would do.
Hey, it's Robin at the Australian. Give us a call.
We do not speak of our down market rivals like that. Anyway, so we now have a new CEO of Qantas, Vanessa Hudson, who was previously the CFO. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Jake. We've not had a big interview or a big announcement from her since she's taken over. Do you think that's a purposeful decision? Because for me, if you've got this whole storm of Alan Joyce leading, now is the time you want leadership. If I were her, or if I were like, their communications team or the PR agency or the crisis comms people, I would say you need to go out and do lots of television interviews, kind of introduce yourself to the country, tackle everything head on, talk loudly about a fresh start. But it feels that she's kept a relatively low profile. Am I right, Jake?
It's possible that she's kind of waiting for the current storm to blow over before, waiting for everyone to finish their fusillade before she sticks her head over the ramparts, if you will. There have been, a couple of things like, for example, Rita Saffioti, the WA tourism minister, did the other day sort of call on Hudson to bury the hatchet with Perth Airport about this long-running dispute they have over Qantas planning. Qantas's move to Airport Central, which is sort of the centralised terminal, because currently Qantas flights, international ones especially, operate out of a terminal that's like 20 minutes away from the rest of the airport. So there have been calls for that. In general, it has been pretty quiet from Vanessa Hudson. It's possible that Qantas hasn't had any big good news announcements to make, which she could put her stamp on, particularly since that big plane order was something that Joyce announced before he exited.
I think what potentially could have happened here and maybe should have happened is on day one of Vanessa's leadership, we saw an internal video that she released to all staff. The snippets of that video that I've seen, there's no personality, there's no excitement. It was very monotone. And for news on the mainstream media, we saw a couple of video clips of her chatting to check-in staff, and it was all smiley, happy faces.
Yeah.
What I think Vanessa and the Qantas team could have done is come out and said, new chapter, new beginnings, give us a chance. We've heard your feedback. We're listening. We're working to make things better.
That was the obvious thing to do,
Yeah.
and obviously there was an element. It was all kind of short notice with Alan Joyce leaving, but I did find it kind of gobsmacking that it's been relatively quiet from her.
I mean, you could say that coming out and saying new chapter, new beginnings in the middle of several raging controversy storms is probably not going to help matters. So, like I said, it could be sort of a move from Vanessa Hudson and the Qantas team to kind of lay low until everything settles down and the media cycle and the politics cycle moves on to talking about something else.
One of the interesting things is we don't really know Vanessa, and in fact the public don't really know her. You made this brilliant point, whatever it was, probably like 6 months or so now, that the whole transition period, it was, or at least should have been, an opportunity to introduce Vanessa to the public. That did not it felt like that did not really happen at all. It was still very much the Alan Joyce show. Now Alan is gone, we're still just talking about Alan Joyce. We're still talking about him. He's still the figurehead. We're not really talking about Vanessa. From a communications point of view, it feels like she's not got a grip of this. Again, I don't want to judge her and say she's this or she's that, because we don't know. We don't really know yet. The cynic would say, or the criticism would be, that she was chosen to be a kind of a successor to Joyce to kind of keep to keep the good work continuing. Somebody was obviously across the numbers, across the details. If you were looking at this afresh now, and if the decision on the successor had been made, knowing what we did, that you would have thought perhaps we'd have brought in a fresh face, because she's still been a Qantas lifer, that you'd want somebody who was charismatic and maybe more media friendly.
There's been a lot of sort of comments saying, well, she's part of the problem. She is the new boss, same as the old boss.
The danger, there's true. I agree with that, and I don't agree with that. So as a CFO, she would not have been involved in a lot of the controversies. They were directly. That was not in her kind of remit. But having been there for so long and been such a crucial part of a leadership team, she is still, to an extent, tainted with that.
Well, I think, Adam, sorry to cut you off there, but when you look at when Joyce was first announced as the new CEO, taking over from Jeff Dixon, Joyce wasn't part of the Qantas leadership board. He was the then Jetstar CEO. And everyone, when Jeff Dixon announced his intentions to leave, everyone had it pinned that John Borghetti was going to get the role of CEO, because he was a Qantas lifer, he was Mr. Brand, Mr. Qantas, Mr. Woohoo. But they went in a totally different direction by bringing Joyce in from a low-cost carrier. So technically, Vanessa, although a CFO in her role, was part of Joyce's leadership team.
He was in the inner
Qantas.
circle. She was in the inner circle.
Yeah, so she was definitely within the inner circle. Was she privy to all the inner workings and inner decisions? Maybe, maybe not. I almost wonder, is she the sacrificial lamb?
This is what I was going to get to.
Sorry to steal your thunder.
No. This is what I was going to get to.
Yeah, it's a tough one, but I think right now what will help brand Qantas is for Vanessa to come out and say, we know we have work to do. We know we need to rebuild the public trust. And my team and I have heard you, and we're working on that.
But she's not said that yet. She's
not
had a
said
week.
that yet.
There have been statements to that effect from Qantas spokespeople, like the Qantas team or the Qantas PR people have said that we know we have work to do where we want to regain the public's trust. But as to your point, it really should be Vanessa Hudson herself saying we want to turn over, we want to start fresh.
There's an analogy in British politics that a good prime minister is someone who dictates the agenda. They don't get battered by the waves of whatever it is happening that week. And at the moment, it feels like what she needed to do was take a grip of this situation, go out there, do a big interview, sit-down interview with the ABC or Channel 7 or whatever it is.
Or Australian Aviation. Vanessa, call us.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And we will give you a fair hearing here. And if you are listening, Vanessa, and I'd like to think she is.
Absolutely.
I'd like to think that all of the board do. In all seriousness, if you would like to come and talk directly to the industry, we'd love to have you on this show, and we will give you an hour. We give you a fair hearing. We always try to be very balanced, so that offer is always open. It's quite cheeky of us to say this, but the offer is always open to you.
And it's offered, and it's still open to Alan Joyce as well.
Exactly, of course.
Alan, you're not busy right now, right? You're not busy anymore.
He will be on the beach now, isn't he?
Yeah.
He'll be down in Manly.
He's in Antarctica, sailing Antarctica, wasn't he?
True.
The night of his last day, he flew out to Dublin to visit his mammy.
Oh, really?
Oh, that's nice.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Alan, if you're listening from Dublin, if you're still in Dublin, when you get back from Dublin, where are you? We've not gone anywhere.
And if you want to do it from Dublin, in fact, we've got internet here.
Yeah,
We've got
we've got
technology.
That's do they have internet in Dublin?
They
though?
absolutely do. They're actually booming in Ireland
Yeah.
right now. Low tax economy, doing very well. Anyway,
Sorry to all our Irish listeners.
So what I would say, and again, this does sound very cynical, but to pick up the point you said there, if you were a cynic looking in, you would say that Qantas is in for a rough 18 months, no matter what, because they're going to have this ACCC court case, which will end up becoming one of the most high-profile court cases in Australian history. It will be poured over. They're still going to, for another 18 months, have this kind of talent crisis and the skill shortage. They're still going to have a bad relationship with the union. So they're in for a tough 18 months. The argument would be that she's going to be there like a sacrificial lamb, this kind of human shield to soak it all up, and then she will go and a fresh, new, charismatic face will come in. It feels a very harsh thing to say, but
I think that's what's going to happen.
Yes.
And
Well,
I hate to say that. But
Yeah.
I will also say one thing before we, I guess, move on. And again, probably an unpopular comment. Don't shoot the messenger. This is my opinion and my opinion alone. If you're a current Qantas employee pissed off with the system, don't take those frustrations out on your passengers, on your customers.
Yeah.
Give them a reason to come back to Qantas. You may be annoyed with the processes and management, but that's any workplace.
Yeah.
It's not exclusive to Qantas. There are people in every single workplace that dislike the rules or the regulations or the policies and procedures. Don't bring that frustration to work. Do not take it out on fair-paying passengers. Smile. Give them a reason to come back. And you and I, Adam, over the last few months have had several Qantas flights. Some of them were absolutely fantastic. Some of them were absolutely woeful. And it comes down to the customer experience.
a wise man once said to me, check your ego at the door.
Absolutely. Check your ego at the door.
Now, of course, if the customers are being horrible, then you can feel free to.
No, you can't. No, you misunderstand.
You have my permission. I don't know if you'd have Qantas' permission, but you
There's
have my
rules
permission
to follow and appropriate ways to handle a customer being out of line. But I think it's important for Qantas employees.
My permission is not legally binding.
It's toughen up, Buttercup. It is what it is, but be thankful that you've still got a job in an industry that hundreds, thousands of people want to get into.
It could be worse.
It could be worse.
On that note, we're going to go for a quick break. When we come back, we're still going to be talking about Qantas, but we're going to have a break. We'll be back in a minute. Okay, welcome back. So I do apologise that this is yet again becoming a show entirely about Qantas, but this is the biggest story of the year. And when we talk about the waves of bad feeling that have hit Qantas, one that's kind of semi-hit them and also hit the federal government is this ongoing furor over Qatar Airways being blocked from putting on extra flights. this first started actually now a couple of months ago, where the Transport Minister, Catherine King, rejected their request to have more flights. She said, as I agree, this is actually quite a typical thing, that this kind of lands on her desk, and she's rejected it. It has now become a massive story, I would argue, in part of the hopeless communications response from Labour and possibly also from Qantas, but also a very savvy communication response from Qatar, because the story is now that the government are, in bed with Qantas. It's all a big love-in, and Labour have done Qantas a big favour by blocking out one of their big rivals. In actual fact, the argument against this is simply that Qatar, if they wanted to, could just put bigger aircraft on their existing routes, and also quite sensibly, but if we give additional slots effectively to Qatar, we are ultimately at some point taking away potential slots from other carriers, and they have quite a lot as it is. But this thing has spiraled, really. Again, it's a story that just will not go away.
And shamefully, it's become a global story now.
We've had a number of follow-ups this week. So, Jake, talk us through what the latest on this is.
So this was announced this morning, Tuesday morning, as we're recording the podcast, that Emirates has... I don't know if it was intentional, but Emirates has kind of given the government a hand in this matter by essentially doing what the Transport Minister Catherine King and what Qantas has been advising Qatar to do if it wants to increase its capacity, and using bigger planes. It is announced this morning that Tuesday morning that it will. It has 3 daily services to Sydney at the moment. One of them is currently operated by a 777-300. That is going. It is going to be replaced by an A380. So that will add something like 2,000 seats per week on that route just by using a larger plane.
One of the fascinating things about this is Emirates obviously made this decision, but in their kind of formal press release they put out, they not subtly at all pointed to the furor over the Qatar Airways. At no point did they mention Qatar, but what they said is, even though we're putting on extra capacity, this does not necessarily mean that prices will come down, because prices are affected by many things. Now, one of the arguments Qatar made was that if you give us extra flights, that means more competition. More competition means
more
prices
capacity,
go down.
more seats available, demand increases. Sorry, supply increases, demand
Exactly.
goes down.
Now, obviously, we've spoken about this a few weeks ago, and it's kind of not murky, but this kind of bizarre kind of love triangle with all of the people involved in this, because obviously Qantas and Qatar, I'll get all these names right, are obviously rivals, that they're competing for international routes.
Also in the same alliance.
We'll get into that. It is the murkiest love triangle. So you've got Qantas and Qatar are kind of technically rivals. Obviously, you've got Virgin, who have now pretty much stopped long haul, or the majority of their long haul international operation. They are in a code share agreement with Qatar. So obviously, if Qatar put on more flights, that's good for Virgin. It's bad for Qantas. But also, bizarrely, there's a kind of loveless relationship that Qantas are also technically in a code share relationship with Qatar as well.
Well, Qantas is definitely in a code share relationship with Emirates.
Definitely. And they're in a very close code share relationship, because not only are they in the same code share group, but more importantly, they have this long-standing deal, sort of rubber stamped by the ACCC, which allows them to actually collaborate and exchange details of routes.
It's a bizarre sort of proxy war, isn't it, between Qantas and Virgin using Emirates and Qatar?
Yeah, it's exactly what it is. That is the best analogy I've heard. It is the Cold War of aviation. We need to incorporate that in one of the
Cold War of aviation.
There's a feature right there.
Who are the Soviets in this? I mean, they both use red. I don't know who.
The whole thing is very, very bizarre. But Emirates, basically, who are in a very close relationship with Qantas, they're effectively like sister airlines, have almost rowed to Qantas's and the federal government's rescue, and have all but explicitly acknowledged this and how they've announced it, because what they have done is exactly what Labour said Qatar should do. Just put some bigger planes on there.
Devil's advocate here. Pre-COVID, Emirates, from memory, used to fly 4 times a day into Sydney. 3 of those 4 flights were A380 operated, with the 4th one being a 777ER. Pre-COVID, Qatar Airways operated an A380 into Sydney with their daily allocation of flights and still do. So they can't put a bigger plane on a Sydney route because they've already got the largest aircraft, passenger aircraft, operating into Sydney. Brisbane, they're currently operating a 777, so they could upgauge Brisbane if they wanted to. And one of the services into Melbourne, I believe, is an A380, so can't go any bigger than that. And they're using the back door with a flight via Adelaide using the 777.
Point to water. It's to Adelaide via Melbourne.
Sorry, Jake, you're correct. So to Adelaide via Melbourne, it's a 777. They can't. Adelaide can't.
This is essentially though a story about kind of how many slots they're being given. This is what I find fascinating about this is a really nerdy aviation news story, right? Of an allocation of routes. Something so boring. This is something that would be nerdy even for us. And yet this has gone on to become a major national news story. And it's been a major national story for 2 months and shows no sign of slowing down. Kudos to Qatar and their comms team who played a blinder.
And Virgin.
And Virgin as well. They have played an absolute blinder at the same time as the team responsible for the federal government, Catherine King's team, and Qantas all seem to have completely messed this up here.
Well, Anthony Albanese has apparently gotten fed up with this whole thing.
He's putting his foot down, isn't he?
He came out swinging in question time on Monday. Basically, so he was asked a number of questions around Qantas and about Qatar. So Melissa Price, the MP for Durack, she asked, have you hosted Alan Joyce at Kirribilli House of the Lodge? Did you discuss the Qatar decision? Albanese said, I'm sorry, you should probably direct that question to Scott Morrison because Joyce has... This is quote from Anthony Albanese. Joyce has never been at Kirribilli or the Lodge on my watch, not once. The last time he was there, Scott Morrison was the Prime Minister of Australia. He has come out and basically said Peter Dutton has been lying about Alan Joyce, lobbying the Prime Minister at the Lodge or Kirribilli. He has sort of put his foot down and said, the coalition sided with Qantas when it grounded its fleet in 2011 and locked out its workforce. He said, we stood up for the workforce. He said they sided with Qantas when its major competitor Virgin collapsed into administration in 2020. They sided with Qantas when it sacked and outsourced thousands of its workforce. They delivered $2.7 billion in taxpayer support, including almost $900 million in JobKeeper, without putting in place any mechanism to get funding back. So basically, Albanese is saying, "I'm sorry, we're not the ones who are getting all cozy with Qantas here. It's you."
And I agree with all of that because people have very, very, very short memories. I remember reporting on this, and we have said this previously on the show. Only a year or two ago, the accusation was that there was a very close relationship between the coalition, federal government and Qantas. That's all been erased from memory. And one of the points that Albanese makes very strongly today is one of the biggest criticisms is apparently... and we spoke about this, apparently how much Qantas, how much JobKeeper money and how much public money Qantas sort of hoovered up during COVID. But it was Labour at the time that said that when you do JobKeeper, you needed some process in future where it could be clawed back. You needed to account for that.
Correct.
So there's an element that they are having a go at Labour. I don't want to get political, but they're having a go at Labour over something that really they were saying themselves years ago. And I can understand why Albanese is looking at this and going, well, this is absurd. He also history.
He also talked about the Qatar thing, and he sort of made the same point you did, Adam. He said that the move to block the Qatar expansion was, this is a quote from Hansard, a status quo nothing decision.
Yes.
He was asked why the minister Catherine King didn't inform him straight away, and he said this was just maintaining what was in place beforehand. He said, quote, the idea that when I'm at a NATO summit, he was, discussing Ukraine, the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government thinks she'll ring me up or contact me to tell me that nothing is happening is just bizarre.
Agreed.
I can also confirm that the Minister for Environment and Water didn't ring me up to tell me that nothing was happening. The Treasurer didn't ring me up to tell me that nothing was happening. The Minister for Education didn't ring me up to tell me that nothing was happening. And the Minister for Climate Change and Energy didn't ring me up to tell me that he was still sticking to net zero by 2050. The idea that this was front and centre while I was at a NATO summit discussing a land war in Europe with all the global inflationary consequences that were going on is quite frankly absurd.
That's quite a withering comment. I mean, he's not how bad. But he's got a point, isn't he? Because you've got the Transport Minister, and while ultimately the Prime Minister is in charge, you've got to let the Transport Minister get on with the job. Correct. And his argument is that this is the sort of decisions
that Transport Ministers make all the time.
Because they're called the Transport Minister. So I do on this have enormous sympathy and think this has just got a little bit out of hand, and this has just got a little bit silly.
As an aside, there was another question. I don't want to get too too political, but I will say kind of a grubby question coming from Bradfield MP Paul Fletcher, which was sort of implying that Albanese had done a dirty deal with Alan Joyce to win Qantas' support for the yes side in the referendum in exchange for blocking Qatar. You know, he sort of all but came out and said that. And the PM basically said, I don't know if you've noticed, but every major business in Australia is supporting the yes campaign. Woolworths, Coles, Telstra, BHP, Rio Tinto, the Business Council, the Catholic Church, the Imams Council, the AFL, the NRL, Rugby Australia, and Netball Australia. And he said that Qantas has been on the side of Indigenous recognition for quite a long time. So that's a kind of a low blow, I will say, from Paul Fletcher on that question, and really not a good look.
No.
I think the whole thing's absurd. It is what it is. Minister King has made her decision for reasons we will never be privy to. We've heard leaks that it was partly due to the incident with the Australians being forcibly removed off that aircraft years ago, or in 2019, I think
it was 2020.
2020. An unfortunate incident. But look, at the end of the day, it is what it is. Qatar certainly have the backing of a lot of tourism industry saying, let them fly, let them in. Flight Centre did a massive campaign, an ad campaign recently, basically took out full-page ads, basically saying, let them fly. It's Qantas compete with Qatar on routes to London and to Rome. But that's it, because Qantas don't fly anywhere else in Europe at the moment.
Yes,
so it's all the code sharing with Emirates.
Exactly right. So
but basically this was and I can understand they never thought this was much of an issue, but if they'd have just handled it better 2 months ago,
correct,
they could have nipped this in the bud. So if I was Catherine King, I would have turned around if someone had asked me and gone, 2 reasons. One, they've got bad form with the invasive searches, and that has to be an undertone. There's not yet been an apology. And even though they've said this quite late, I do think that was in the back of people's minds, 100%. Yep. And said, look, at the moment they're on thin ice with us as a nation, and we have to bear that in mind. And secondly, if we give them extra flights, that is taking away potential extra flights we could give to other carriers. And as we seek to rebuild our international networks, we need to have as many things open as possible. Obviously, we want to be looking at other international airlines starting to increase their capacities, and this is a sort of tough decision we have to make. And if they'd have done that, which sounds very reasonable, this thing would have been nipped in the bud. But it was such a kind of faff they made in trying to explain it and looking guilty.
Just endless, not in the national interest, not in the national interest, not in the national interest. And if they'd sort of explained it a bit better at the start.
Well, here's a link for you. Talking about national interests, we've got a green paper ahead of a white paper. And this is essentially, for those of you people that understand the defence world, which we kind of semi hang around in, there was the kind of a DSR earlier this year, which was essentially like a big government review that sort of looked at what the future of Australian defence would be like, and not quite as dramatic as the DSR, but the federal government has announced there's going to be essentially a kind of review of all of aviation and how aviation is going to move forward in this kind of post-COVID world, which started off with a green paper ahead of next year's white paper. For those of us who are unsure what all of these different papers are, talk us through what it is and what this means to the industry.
Yeah, the white paper coming out next year is basically, going to be setting the policy direction that the government undertakes in regards to aviation over the next 10 years or so. The green paper, which was released last week, is basically like a 200 something page document that's basically laying out what the government is wanting to look at and saying, we want your feedback. We want submissions. We want the industry. We want consumers. We want everyone to have their say before we put the white paper together next year. Because the white paper is going to be setting the policy direction for the aviation sector out to 2050. So it is a big document. So it's going to be looking at areas like the transition to net zero, consumer protections, competition, affordability. There was some comments from Catherine King in question time on Monday. She was saying that industry performance is not good enough. She was pointing to rising complaints about the aviation sector, as well as these barriers to travel for passengers with disabilities. The paper did note that there are that disabled passengers are seen as an afterthought. They're denied travel with assistance animals. There's a lack of accessible flight options in regional or remote areas. There's limited aircraft capacity for wheelchairs, extended unreasonable check-in times, insufficient information for airlines on accessibility arrangements, a lack of communication and complaint mechanisms. Minister King said it is not good enough that service standards are as low as they are. And she says, quote, "I do say really clearly, airlines need to do better when it comes to Australian consumers. I've been highly critical of Qantas for some time in relation to a range of issues. They need to do better. All consumers in Australia deserve to have access to a decent aviation service, and that's what we're delivering through the Aviation White Paper." She also has indicated that, and this is coming back to a long-running saga of ours, Sydney slots are probably going to get a bit more of a look in before the white paper is released. Because as long-time listeners will know, Sydney Airport is essentially full to bursting. These prime takeoff slots are being, taken up by airlines like, Qantas and Virgin, the big major carriers. And there have been sort of accusations that big airlines like Qantas and Virgin are gaming the system by cancelling too many flights. Because essentially, if you hold on to a takeoff slot, if you run a takeoff slot 80% of the time, you can keep it indefinitely. And so Sydney Airport has called on that to be reduced to you need to do it to 90. You need to run the flight 95% of the time, is what Sydney Airport wants. So this slot system is apparently going to get a bit of a look in before the white paper because, we've got airlines like Rex and Bonds and all that saying we can't get slots at Sydney Airport because they are, so full.
It's interesting.
That was a great rant over.
Yeah, no, that was a rant over, and that was a great explainer for everybody else. Usually I have to do the explainer, so I'm grateful for you doing that. One of the things that's quite interesting is that we were saying a few weeks ago on the show that even though there was all the chat, it didn't feel the government was listening in terms of this slot things. Clearly, they've been listening. I'd like to think they listened to this show. You're welcome. But no, clearly, now they have made a statement that they are listening, and it does feel that there's going to be a change coming to the slot system, which has caused all sorts of controversy. Now, Sydney Airport, I believe, if my memory serves me correct, have pushed for a new rule where it's 95.5.
Yeah. I did mention Sydney Airport wants it so that the airlines have to run the flight 95% of the time in order to keep the slot.
Now, call me cynical. I believe they're saying 95.5, knowing that they'll never get 95.5, but thinking that they might get 90.10.
Correct.
That's where I see it going. I think, off the top of my head, that is a figure that John Sharp, the current deputy chairman of Rex, formerly Transport Minister back in the day, that implemented this, that's what he now says he should have done. It needs to be a lot more strict. If or when that happens, which I think is very likely, there's going to be enormous pushback from Qantas and Virgin. Something I would say cynically would now play in the hands of the federal government looking to be winding up Qantas.
Yes, I think there's an axiom in Australian politics: you never lose votes by bashing the banks. I think right now you could probably say you'll never lose votes by bashing Qantas.
No.
Speaking of bashing Qantas, there was a bit of a story in the Daily Telly and the other News Corp tabloids the other week that I just want to call attention to. This was last week. They were saying that Qantas frequent flyer points have been significantly devalued. Saying, oh yes, well a flight, points that could have bought you a first-class return flight to Los Angeles back in the day will now buy you a coffee machine or a one-way economy class ticket to Beirut.
Inflation.
Well, yes, that's the thing, because the figures that the figure of comparison is that yes, these points could have bought you a return first-class flight to LA in 1996. And, there was a very reasonable point made by a fellow from Point Hacks, who essentially he went on the radio and he said, this is kind of a nothing. It's kind of a nothing burger. He said, this was Daniel Siberis of Point Hacks. Thank you, Daniel. He was speaking to 3AW. He said that, yes, this is technically accurate that the points are worth less now, but this was comparing 2023 to 1996. He says, the issue I've got with that whole article and comparison is that you're comparing 1996 to 2023. And look, if someone wants to offer me a brand new car at 1996 prices, I'd be more than happy to say yes. Also, there's inflation there as well. He says the cost of flying today is obviously higher than it was back in 1996. And so the points cost for a lot of reward flights have also gone up.
I understand that the kind of the comparison, I think it was the Daily Telegraph, as you said, we're trying to make. But it's such a messy, tangled thing. I don't necessarily think it's fair to do this kind of like-for-like comparison.
And Qantas has, in a statement to the telly, they said that 155 billion frequent flyer points were used last year. Reward seat availability on the network internationally has been increased by 50% since borders reopened. 1 in every 11 Qantas passengers flew on a classic reward seat in the past year. There are currently more than 5 million available to book. They said the number of points needed for a classic reward seat hasn't changed in 4 years. So, yes, again, technically this is correct, but it seems like a bit of a reach to be comparing 2023 points as they are now to, points as they were worth when my lovely fiancé was born.
Yeah. Well, I mean, back in 1996...
Jenny, if you're listening, love you.
Everything was better back in 1996. The music was better. My hairline was better. I imagine your hairline was better as well.
My hairline was a lot better in 1996.
My hairline was, I think, probably a bowl cut because I was 4 years old.
Wow. Now I feel old.
Yeah,
So
but again, Jenny, if you're listening, thank you for letting me use you as a point of comparison on frequent flyer issues.
Right. Now, before we wrap up, I've got a bit of a curveball I'm going to throw in. I've not
Pitch it.
I've not told you. Now, this is a story that we didn't run on Australian aviation because Australian aviation is, of course, the very highest bar of journalism, focusing on the most important local stories.
Absolutely.
However, one story that got everyone sniggering around the office, which seemed to go huge globally, was a Delta flight that had to turn around. I don't care, I'm going to do it. That had to turn around because a passenger had diarrhea all the way through the plane.
We're supposed to be a sophisticated publication, Adam.
Yes, but we're going to talk about it. This was deemed an onboard medical emergency, according to The Guardian, and a biohazard event. There was some quite extraordinary videos and pictures. Look, Chris is he's roaring with laughter.
Shit happens.
Wow, yes. There's a better pun than anything you've ever come out with, Jay.
I dispute that.
Right. So everyone had this reaction. There was some extraordinary photos and videos. Again, I don't want to degrade this.
You already have, Adam. You already have.
What I can say is stuff like this does happen in Australia as well.
This is why I brought it up, because Chris, as well as being cabin crew, was cabin crew manager. Rule with an iron fist. And while I'm sure you've not seen anything quite as bad as this,
I can better that.
Better that. That's what I wanted. That's what I wanted.
That.
Go on.
I was on a flight from Sydney to Rockhampton.
Oh, that is automatically better.
Well, we were approaching Brisbane when a passenger's colostomy bag exploded everywhere in the cabin, going all over the walls, the windows, the seats, the carpet, the passengers, and me.
And what did you do, being the consummate professional?
I tried really hard not to throw up. Went and alerted the captain, and we diverted to Brisbane for a biohazard emergency landing.
Wow, so you've also had a biohazard emergency landing too?
I've had a biohazard emergency landing as well.
Wow.
So shit does happen here in Australia as well. Pardon the French.
Does happen.
Speaking of a growing stench around the aviation industry, there we go. There's a segue to a more highbrow topic, possibly the highest of brow topics, the Qantas Chairman's Lounge.
Oh, that is not your finest link. We've gone from one extreme to the other. Yes, let's end this on a non-toiletry note. Go on.
There's been all sorts of stories coming out about Qantas's most exclusive club recently.
The Chairman's Lounge.
The Chairman's Lounge.
Why aren't we in it is the first thing. I mean, we abhor corruption, but...
Well, yes, look, I will say, if we were invited to the Qantas Chairman's Lounge...
Wink.
We would politely decline. Because of,
talk for yourself.
I can't speak for them. I would politely decline due to reasons of ethics. But it would be nice to be invited. It would be nice to have the opportunity to take the moral high ground and say no. But the Qantas Chairman's Lounge invite, for those of you who don't know, is an invite-only essentially club that Qantas has for, celebrities, business leaders, major clients.
People like us.
It's apparently not. And politicians. Every member of parliament gets an invitation to the Chairman's Lounge, which is apparently very, very nice. You get, a swanky secret entrance in the airport, steak dinners, unlimited cocktails. A Qantas staff will politely come and inform you when your flight is due to depart. You get, utter privacy. And this is a 2-year term, sort of renewable at Qantas's discretion. But, most members of Parliament are members of the Chairman's Lounge. I think it's come out today that every High Court justice is a member of the Chairman's Lounge. And I don't know. I mean, we were talking about grubby situations on planes, but this is it's. Politicians shouldn't be members of the Chairman's Lounge.
As a proud investigative journalist, I feel that I need to put the rubber gloves on and see this personally and experience this personally myself for at least a couple of years in order that I would be able to write about this with real integrity. At the moment...
According to one of the ministers the other night on a TV show, I think the 7:30 report, she said, whoop-de-doo, stale peanuts. Is what she gets in the Chairman's Lounge.
Really?
And another minister also on the same panel said that the food's a lot nicer than stale peanuts. So, look, I guess there's...
Whoop-de-doo stale peanuts is a great response to just anything, really.
Correct. Because most of us have to buy cold food court food if we're sitting in a departure lounge at an airport waiting for a flight.
Just you get a phone. You're at work and you get a phone call from some customer who's complaining about some issue or another, and you go, "Oh, whoop-de-doo, stale peanuts." We should make that catch on. But look, it raises questions, doesn't it?
I mean, I would say, and I wouldn't turn down an invite, wink. I would say...
I would.
You would. All right. It's
on principle.
His fingers are crossed.
Yeah. I mean, this is another example of this extraordinary pile-on Qantas in the last couple of weeks, because clearly the Chairman's Lounge has been going for a long, long time, and only this week have we started to pile on it. I know there was some controversy over apparently whether or not Anthony Albanese's son was given a pass to it, but nonetheless, that's a story that should have come and gone, but it's kind of continued to go. I do accept the whole kind of concept is extraordinary, that you have an invite-only club. It feels like the ultimate lobbying tool, because clearly you can restrict passes into Parliament, but if Qantas own the lounge, they are the kings of the lounge, and they can, and people kind of love this stuff. It's also worth mentioning, which again is not mentioned in any of these stories, that a lot of other major airlines in the world have the exact same equivalent.
Virgin does have one.
Yeah, Virgin has the Beyond lounges, but also
are the Beyond lounges just their regular ones, or
I think the Beyond lounges is their top tier.
Because I think Virgin has one that's just called the Club or something. But
sounds very nice.
But as apparently, politicians are also members of that, which I guess would provide balance. But it's like, it seems to me, fair enough that like your, important clients or, celebrities or whatever might get a bit of extra access, but to give it to politicians,
so what I would suggest,
people who are making laws about your company seems, I don't know.
So how about, in order to both enjoy the benefits and obviously conduct ourselves with integrity, we say that we take away the passes for the politicians and all of those people, and they give them only to aviation journalists who need that to help report on the news. That way, play along. That way, we get in the lounge and we get all the benefits, but we can claim a moral victory. That's a lovely way to end the show, isn't it?
It wouldn't be a moral victory, Adam. It would. Yes,
I'm with you, Adam.
Yes, I will get me in there.
Listen. I am, of course, above reproach.
You're a man of integrity.
I'm a man of integrity. But,
Yeah.
other aviation journalists
Yeah.
and other publications out there might start being very, very favourable to Qantas.
No, I mean, if we're going to write about the Chairman's Lounge, we have to be in it. That, to me, is integrity.
Correct.
It's about seeing things firsthand to get the facts.
But Adam, you were correct. Qantas and Virgin are not alone.
No.
Every single airline globally has the equivalent of a chairman's lounge, a VIP only lounge. It is often CEO invite. And globally, most politicians are invited to be a member of lounge.
It was mentioned, I think, in the AFR that it's more instructive possibly to look at which politicians aren't members of the Chairman's Lounge. I think, for example, Tony Sheldon is not a member.
No.
Which,
Not surprising.
Unsurprising. Whether or not they've offered it to him, I don't think he would have taken it up anyway.
No.
I think there is most of the politicians on both sides of the aisle. I think most of the Greens as well. Might be Max Chandler Mather, who's not a member. And I have read in the AFR as well that Jackie Lambie is not a member of the Chairman's Lounge, not because she wasn't invited, but because she went off at a Qantas staffer.
Wow.
Which is possibly the most on-brand reason for Jackie Lambie to not be a member of the Chairman's
But we
Lounge.
have if any lawyers are listening, we have no definitive evidence of that happened or didn't happen, just to be very clear. That's
What's
pure
more
speculation.
important here, and probably the story they should be focusing on, is politicians should be disclosing the perks they get.
Well, they do. I think they do have to on their register of members' interest. Am I right, Jake?
I believe so. And in the Senate inquiry when they were a few weeks ago when they were asking Alan Joyce about the Chairman's Lounge, it was sort of brought up. I don't remember by who. That members, when asking questions about the Chairman's Lounge, should be disclosing their memberships. And basically, every member who asked something about the Chairman's Lounge said, "Yes, I'm also a member." But yeah, look, register of members' interests. There are, people do declare their membership in the Chairman's Lounge. Let me see. There are some stories here about who is not a member. So Tony Sheldon, not a member. Jackie Lambie, not a member. Max Chandler Mather, reportedly not a member. So there are a few politicians who are not members of the Chairman's Lounge for one reason or another, but the majority of them are. And I don't know, guys. Just, rack up the frequent flyer points like everyone else. Apparently you can get a nice coffee machine with them.
Or get a lovely kind of bacon double cheeseburger at Hungry Jack's like the rest of us.
Hey, apparently in the Chairman's Lounge they will cook you anything that you want, even if it's not on the menu. So maybe, I don't know, ask them to nip out to Red Rooster and get you one of their... Get some of them cheesy nuggets.
We did actually have a Red Rooster on our way back. It was very nice.
Brisbane.
I don't like the new recipe for Red Rooster chicken. Controversial, but I'll say it.
Well, let's end the show now. We will be back on the show same time next week. But before we do finally wrap up, I will say goodbye to the other members of this dysfunctional family. Chris, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me back, Adam.
And Jake, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Adam.
And this madhouse will be back the same time next week. But for now, for us three, goodbye.
Goodbye.